Hi, everybody. My name's Alice Pawley. I'm an associate professor in the School of Engineering Education at Purdue University. And I'm affiliate faculty in environmental and ecological engineering and in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program. And I'm affiliate with the Purdue Climate Change Research Center. Earlier this year in June, so I'm in 2019 here, I had the honor of being invited to speak as the distinguished lecturer for the ERM division at the American Society for Engineering Education annual meeting and exposition. And I'm really grateful to AEE for the invitation to submit that distinguished lecture for publication here. So at the time, my father, this is him, he'd recently died, only in March. And he'd been a respected faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was a scientist and a microscopist, and in his later years, a climate activist. And he'd been asking me at family gatherings for years, what is Purdue doing around the climate crisis? And I never knew what was going on. I was sort of hoping other people were thinking about that. And they are in various ways. Well, this last winter holiday, he asked me a different question. He asked, what is Purdue doing to cut climate emissions by 50% in 11 years? And that got my attention in a way that the other question really hadn't. So indeed, I teach in the first year engineering program. What were we doing to prepare engineers to design a world making 50% fewer carbon emissions in 11 years? And not enough, right? That's for sure. And you may think about what you're doing to reduce, teach your students to reduce climate emissions by 50% in 11 years. Now, at the same time, I was also carrying on my regular research on gender and race in engineering education, and I started to think about the excuses people provide for not acting on plenty of data about what is actually needed regarding diversifying engineering education. And I started to think about how the reasons that people were giving were the same types of reasons that people were giving for not acting on the climate crisis. So I started to think through four scholars' work. George Lakoff, who's a linguist at Berkeley, Gert Biesta, who's an engineering researcher and philosopher, Dorothy Smith, who is a sociologist, and Derek Bell, who I was reading more and more from, who wrote about critical race theory and was in critical legal studies. So from Lakoff, I learned that people are really bad about thinking about systemic causality, and that people don't really use reason to make decisions, which he called Enlightenment reason. So he sort of explains that the belief that people use rational thinking to make decisions, he called that Enlightenment reason. From Biesta, I started to notice that the push for doing evidence-based educational research was maybe distracting us from having important conversations about the nature of engineering education itself, like who's it for and why and what engineering itself even means, and that distraction could constitute a moral threat, and he argued that even a threat to small d democracy. From Dorothy Smith, who I was using in my research, have been using her for years, I learned about ruling relations and how that rules are set up to sort of coordinate people doing work in ways that are counter to their own interests. And I've written about that in other places. And then from Bell, I started to learn about interest convergence, which is the idea that racism only decreases when it's in the interests of white people for it to do so. So all those things made me to start to think that the logics of engineering's diversity and inclusion problem and the logics of engineering's relative inaction on the climate crisis are related. Engineering education's relative inaction on the climate crisis, that those two things are related. So the paper talks about sort of lays out those pieces of the argument and then illustrates how they're related using the analytical tools that these scholars provide. And then it talks about what I think we need to do about it, which is first about helping engineers, particularly engineering students, start having hard conversations about the nature of engineering, for which we collectively are unprepared, professionally unprepared to do. And second, to frame issues of diversity and of the climate crisis as moral questions that we need moral answers to, and which we are similarly currently underprepared to be able to have conversations around. So ultimately, I think we need to develop a moral infrastructure that prepares engineers to think about their obligation to change systems, whether the systems be of white supremacy and patriarchy and heteronormativity that it's built into what it means to be an engineer, or whether it's systems of climate emission production largely by the global north, which will differentially impact poor and marginalized communities across the globe. So I keep coming back to my dad's question, especially now that he's gone. What are we doing to prepare engineers to make a world making 50% fewer climate emissions in 11 years, or for my first year students, for 7 years after they graduate? And then I add in, how is our lack of adequate moral education of engineers producing people who aren't equipped to question the logics that are making us both fail to adequately act on the climate crisis and on diversity and inclusion? So I hope this little teaser prompts you to read the rest of the paper, and I welcome a discussion on the argument. Thank you for watching today.